The mockery started with a chart. Not a weapon, not a threat, not any of the things that produce the kind of response that could be seen coming and prepared for. A chart displayed on the council chamber's main presentation screen by Councillor Veth, a rise of the Theresi sovereignty, during the quarterly security review. A chart that showed the military capability rankings of every conclave member civilization, plotted on a scale that the Theresi diplomatic division had developed, and that the Theresi diplomatic division called the Integrated Capability Index, which was a sophisticated and well-constructed analytical tool that had one significant flaw, which was that it measured what it measured, and did not measure what it did not measure, and what it did not measure was, in this particular case, the most important thing. The chart showed Earth at position 41. Not 41 out of 17,000. 41 out of the 63 civilizations that the Integrated Capability Index assessed as major military powers, the civilizations that the index considered significant enough to rank in the top tier of the conclave's capability distribution. Earth was 41st in that group. The chart was accurate. That was the thing about it that made what followed both understandable and wrong simultaneously, that the chart was accurate within its parameters, that the Theresi diplomatic division had built a good tool and had used it correctly, and had produced an accurate result that was nonetheless producing an incorrect conclusion, because accurate within parameters and accurate about the actual situation were different things, and the difference between them was the thing that mattered. Councillor Arise presented the chart with the professional composure of a senior diplomatic official who was presenting a security assessment, which was what she was doing, with commentary that was professional in its framing, and that communicated, in the gaps between the professional framing, something that was not professional, something that was the opinion that the professional framing was being used to express at a deniable distance. The opinion was that Earth at position 41 was an anomaly that the conclave should address. That a civilization that had been a member for 42 years, and that had been acquiring capabilities and establishing presences, and inserting itself into regional security situations at the rate Earth had been doing, was operating at a level of influence that its position 41 capability index did not justify, and that this mismatch between influence and capability was a structural problem that deserved the Council's attention. She did not say, Earth is overreaching. She said, the capability index suggests an imbalance between Earth's regional presence and its measured military capacity that merits review. It was the same thing. The Council received it. Several members responded with the specific quality of response that professional diplomatic settings produced when something has been said that people agree with, but cannot say they agree with too directly. The oblique support that came in the form of questions that were structured to receive confirming answers and of observations that echoed the presented point from a slightly different angle. Earth's seat on the Council was occupied by a junior diplomatic officer named Ryo, who was 28 years old and who had been on the Council floor for 6 months covering for Ambassador Reyes, who was at a bilateral session on the other side of the station. Ryo had the quality that 6 months of Council floor experience produced in junior diplomatic officers who were good at their jobs, which was the ability to maintain professional composure while processing things that the professional composure was not making easier. He maintained professional composure. He took notes. He transmitted the notes to Ambassador Reyes with the notation, ongoing, requires your awareness. Reyes received the notation and the notes and read them during a break in the bilateral session. She read them once. She did not respond to Ryo. She called someone else. The call was to an office at Earth's military command that was not in the publicly available directory of Earth's military structure, and that was answered by a person who did not give their name and who listened to Reyes describe what the Council had spent 43 minutes discussing and who said, when Reyes finished, timeline. Reyes said, I think now is appropriate. The person who had not given their name said, we have been ready for 8 months. Reyes said, I know. The person said, you want the full demonstration or the calibrated one. Reyes said, the one that answers the question the index raised. The person said, "That is the full demonstration." Ray's said, "Yes." The person said, "Understood." Ray's ended the call. She went back into the bilateral session. On the council floor, Ryo continued taking notes. The discussion of the capability index and Earth's position 41 continued for another 22 minutes before Councillor Dreshkin of the Valith raised the point that the index's methodology was a matter that perhaps deserved its own dedicated session, rather than being addressed in the quarterly review, which was the parliamentary move that council members used when they wanted a topic to be continued without being resolved in the current session. The point was accepted. The session moved to the next agenda item. Ryo transmitted an updated notation to Ray's that said, "Session concluded on index discussion. Continuations scheduled." Ray's received it and did not respond. She was thinking about the timing. The timing was the thing that required the most thought, not the response itself, which had been prepared for 8 months and was what it was. The timing. The specific moment at which the response happened would determine what the response communicated, because timing was itself communication, because the gap between provocation and response was a message as much as the response was, and the message that the timing sent was either "we have been waiting for an opportunity" or "this is what we are at all times," and the provocation simply revealed it. She wanted the second message. The second message required the response to feel inevitable rather than reactive, to feel like something that was always going to happen and that the council session had simply made visible. She sat with the timing. She decided the timing was the following morning. She notified the office that had answered without a name. The office said, "Confirmed." At 600 the following morning, the Conclave's standard traffic monitoring systems, which covered the approach corridors to Conclave Station Primara and the surrounding space, registered contacts. Not one contact. Not the normal traffic of diplomatic vessels and commercial transports and survey ships, and all the ordinary movement of 17,000 civilizations going about their business in the space around the Conclave's primary station. Contacts. The number of contacts that the monitoring systems registered at 600 was sufficient to trigger an automatic escalation to the station's security command, which was a threshold that had been established based on historical traffic patterns, and that had not been triggered in the 7 years since it had been set. The security command received the escalation at 6:01, and the duty officer looked at the contact count, and looked at the contact signatures, and looked at the contact headings, and spent 40 seconds confirming that the equipment was functioning correctly before transmitting an urgent notification to the station's senior command structure. The senior command structure was awake and in the monitoring center by 6:15. What they were looking at was a formation, not a random collection of contacts distributed across the approach corridors. A formation with internal geometry, with spacing and heading relationships that communicated organized movement rather than independent transit. A formation that had entered the monitoring zone simultaneously from multiple approach vectors in a way that required coordination, that required the vessels in the formation to have been positioned, and time to arrive at the monitoring threshold at the same moment. They had been positioned and timed. The formation was Earth registry. All of it. Every contact in the formation was broadcasting Earth military transponder signals, broadcasting openly, not concealed, not minimized, the full identification of vessels that had decided that what they were doing was worth being fully visible about. The duty officer transmitted the registration data to the senior command's tactical officer. The tactical officer ran it through the vessel identification database. The database returned no matches. Not partial matches, not near matches, not the kind of result where the system found something similar and flagged it as probable identification. No matches. The vessels in the formation were broadcasting Earth military transponders that were formatted correctly and that identified real Earth military designations, but the vessel classes that the designations referenced were not in the database. The tactical officer ran it again. No matches. She looked at the sensor data that was producing the contacts, and she looked at what the sensor data was showing her about the physical characteristics of the vessels in the formation, and she understood, with the specific understanding that came from being a tactical officer with 20 years of experience looking at sensor data, that the database was not malfunctioning. The database was correct. The vessels were not in the database because the vessels had not been in the database when the database was last updated, which was 3 months ago, which meant the vessels were not 3 months old, which meant they were newer than that or had not been disclosed when they were built, and the tactical officer's 20 years of experience processing these two options produced an assessment that went into her report as vessels not previously disclosed, suggest immediate contact with Earth diplomatic representation for clarification. The monitoring center contacted the Earth diplomatic suite on Conclave Station Primara. They reached Rio. Rio was at his station. He had been at his station since 5:45 because he had received a message from Ambassador Reyes at 5:40 that said, "Be at your station at 5:45. He had been at his station when the monitoring center called, and he answered with the composure of someone who had been expecting the call. The monitoring center said, "Conclave Security is observing a large formation of Earth Registry military vessels approaching Conclave Station Primara. The vessels are not in our identification database. We are requesting clarification." Rio said, "Ambassador Reyes is available to speak with the station's senior command. I will connect you." He connected them. Reyes was in her office. She had been in her office since 5:30. She answered the connection with the composure of someone who had been in her office since 5:30 specifically for this call. The station's senior commander said, "Ambassador Reyes, we have a significant number of Earth military vessels approaching this station. They are not in our database. We are requesting an explanation." Reyes said, "I am aware of the formation. The vessels are conducting a scheduled transit of conclave space as part of a routine operational exercise. The transit corridor passes through this region. I apologize for the short notice on the identification issue. The vessel classes are recent additions to Earth's fleet that have not yet been submitted to the conclave's shared registry. We will submit the registry documentation today." The senior commander said, "The formation is a scheduled transit." Reyes said, "Yes." He said, "The formation is very large." Reyes said, "Earth conducts large-scale exercises periodically. The scale of this one reflects our current operational capacity." He said, "The formation is approaching the station." Reyes said, "The transit corridor passes within visual range of the station. The formation will complete its transit and continue on its scheduled heading. It will not approach the station beyond the standard safety perimeter." He said, "Ambassador Reyes, I need to ask you directly. Is this formation related to the discussions that took place in the council session yesterday?" Reyes was quiet for a moment. She said, "The formation has been planned for 8 months. The timing of its transit through this corridor is coincidental with yesterday's session." The senior commander looked at his tactical officer. The tactical officer looked at him. He said, "Ambassador, coincidental." Reyes said, "The transit corridor is the transit corridor. The formation is on a scheduled exercise. The corridor passes this station. These are the facts." He said, "Yes." She said, "I will ensure the registry documentation is filed today." He said, "Thank you, Ambassador." She said, "Of course. I apologize again for the short notice." She ended the connection. The senior commander looked at his tactical display. He said, "Get me a count." The tactical officer produced a count. He looked at it. He said, "Get me the capability assessment on these vessels." The tactical officer said, "I cannot produce a capability assessment. The vessels are not in the database. I have sensor data, but without the technical specifications, I cannot produce a meaningful assessment." He said, "What can you tell me from the sensor data?" She said, I can tell you the mass profiles and the energy signatures. Both are outside the normal parameters for the vessel classes in the existing database. The mass profiles suggest vessels in the upper range of heavy warship classification. The energy signatures are inconsistent with any known drive configuration. He said, inconsistent how? She said, the output level is higher than any drive configuration in the database produces for vessels of this mass profile by a factor of between 2 and 4 depending on the individual vessel. Either the mass profile readings are incorrect or the drive technology is something we have not seen before. He said, which is more likely? She said, our mass profile sensors are well calibrated. I believe the drive technology is something we have not seen before. He looked at the count. He looked at the mass profiles. He looked at the energy signatures. He said, transmit the full sensor package to the Security Council. Mark it urgent. The Security Council received the sensor package at 6:47. Senior Arbiter Nallon was in her office. She had been in her office since 6:20 because the monitoring center's escalation had been routed to her as a notification, and she had read the notification and had gone to her office. She looked at the sensor package. She looked at the count. She looked at the mass profiles and the energy signatures. She called Counselor Arise. Arise answered with the specific quality of someone who had also received the notification and who was processing it. Nallon said, the transit corridor passes this station. Arise said, yes. Nallon said, the formation is on a scheduled exercise. Arise said, that is what the ambassador said. Nallon said, the timing is coincidental. Arise said, that is also what the ambassador said. Nallon said, do you believe her? Arise was quiet for a long time. She said, I believe the formation has been planned for 8 months. I believe the timing of its transit through this corridor is not coincidental. I believe those two things are both true simultaneously. Nallon said, yes. Arise said, the count. Nallon said, yes. Arise said, and the energy signatures. Nallon said, yes. Arise said, the integrated capability index. Nallon said, yes. Arise said, position 41. Nallon said, yes. They were both quiet for a moment. Arise said, the index measures what it measures. Nallon said, yes. Arise said, it does not measure what it does not measure. Nallon said, apparently not. Arise said, how many vessels in the formation? Nallon looked at the count. She said the number. Arise was quiet for a long time. She said, 8 months. Nallon said, yes. Arise said, they built this in 8 months. Nallon said, they built this in 8 months that we know of. The 8 months is the window between when the registry would have been updated and now. The formation could have been building for longer than 8 months, and we would not know. Arise said, and the drive signatures. Nallon said, inconsistent with known configurations by a factor of 2 to 4. Arise said, the dark matter composite application, the interior volume engineering, the instant relocation drive. We have been receiving disclosures from Earth for 6 years. Nallon said, yes. Arise said, each disclosure has been something we did not know existed. Nallon said, yes. Arise said, each disclosure has come after the capability was already operational. Nallon said, yes. Arise said, and each time we have been receiving the disclosure we have been thinking it was current. Nallon said, and each time it has not been current, it has been what Earth was ready to show us. Arise said, and the formation is what Earth was ready to show us now. Nallon said, the formation is what was always going to be visible when the transit corridor passed this station on a scheduled exercise that has been planned for 8 months. Arise said, coincidental. Nallon said, coincidental. They were both quiet. Then Arise said, the presentation yesterday, the chart. Nallon said, yes. Arai said, I presented an accurate analysis. Nallon said, yes. Arai said, the analysis was correct within its parameters. Nallon said, yes. Arai said, and the parameters were insufficient. Nallon said, yes. Arai said nothing for a long moment. Then she said, the formation will complete its transit and continue on its scheduled heading. Nallon said, that is what the ambassador said. Arai said, and then? Nallon said, and then Earth will file the registry documentation for the vessel classes, and the database will be updated, and the integrated capability index will be recalculated. Arai said, and the new position. Nallon looked at the count and the mass profiles and the energy signatures, and thought about the integrated capability index and its methodology and the recalculation that the new data would produce. She said, I do not think position 41 is going to survive the recalculation. Arai said, no. She said, I do not think the top tier of 63 is going to adequately describe the result either. Arai said, no. She said, the index is going to need a new category. Nallon said, yes. Arai said, what category? Nallon thought about it. She thought about 42 years of Conclave membership, about the dark matter warships and the ancient fleet and the aperture technology and the instant relocation drive and the 7 archaeological sites and the network of relationships and the formation that was currently transiting the corridor that passed Conclave Station Primara on a scheduled exercise that had been planned for 8 months. She thought about Tuesday. She said, the category for a civilization that has been doing the work for long enough that showing you the work is a transit corridor away. Arai said nothing. Nallon said, schedule an emergency session of the Security Council. Not today. The ambassador will need time to file the registry documentation, and the council will need time to review it. Tomorrow morning. Arai said, tomorrow morning. Nallon said, tell the council to read the documentation before they arrive, all of it. She ended the call. She looked at her display. The formation was on the tactical overlay now, the full picture of it visible from the station's external sensors, the geometry of it clear against the background of space. She had been on the Security Council for 31 years. She had seen a significant number of things in 31 years that had required her to update her understanding of what significant meant. She was updating it. The formation moved through the transit corridor with the specific deliberateness of something that knew exactly where it was going and what it was doing, and that understood that being seen was part of what it was doing. Not threatening, not posturing. Being present in the way that things were present when they had decided that presence was the message, and the message was important. It passed the station at 900. The council chamber had a viewport that faced the transit corridor. Several councillors were at the viewport at 900. Councillor Ares was among them. She watched the formation pass. She looked at the count and the mass profiles that the sensor data had described, and that the formation confirmed visually, confirmed in the way that visual confirmation was different from sensor data, in the way that seeing something was different from reading about seeing it. She looked at position 41. She thought about the chart she had presented yesterday. She thought about accuracy within parameters and accuracy about the actual situation. She thought about what she had communicated in the gaps between the professional framing and what Earth had communicated in the gap between receiving that communication and this morning. She thought about 8 months. The formation passed the station and continued on its scheduled heading. At 9:47, Ambassador Reyes filed the registry documentation with the Conclave's shared vessel database. The documentation was comprehensive. Complete technical specifications for the vessel classes in the formation, the drive configurations, the hull compositions, the weapons systems, the production capacity that had produced the formation in the period since the database had last been updated. The tactical officer at the monitoring center received the documentation and spent 2 hours reading it. Then she called the senior commander. She said, "I have reviewed the registry documentation." He said, and she said, "The drive signatures are consistent with a new application of the observer fabric relationship technology that Earth disclosed 3 years ago. The mass profiles are accurate. The hull composition is a development of the dark matter composite technology from 4 years ago. The production timeline in the documentation is consistent with what the energy signatures and mass profiles suggest." He said, "The production timeline?" She said, "Yes." He said, "How long?" She said, "The documentation shows a production program initiated 14 months ago. The formation we observed is the first full operational deployment." He said, 14 months. She said, "Yes." He said, "For a formation of that count at those specifications?" She said, "Yes." He looked at his display. He said, "And what comes after the first full operational deployment?" She said, "The documentation does not address subsequent production. It documents the current formation." He said, "Right." She said, "But the production program is described as ongoing." He said, "Right." She said, "The program capacity is documented." He said, and she said, "The program capacity at current rate for an ongoing program suggests that the formation we observed this morning is not the full picture." He looked at his display for a long time. He said, "File the full assessment with the Security Council. Mark it for tomorrow's session." She said, "Yes, sir." She filed it. At 1400, Ambassador Reyes received a message from Senior Arbiter Nallon. The message said, "The Security Council will convene tomorrow at 900. We would like you to attend. We would like to discuss the formation, the registry documentation, the production program, and the Integrated Capability Index revision. We would also like to discuss how we make sure that the next time a chart is presented to this council about Earth's capabilities, the chart is accurate." Reyes read the message. She read the part about making sure the chart was accurate. She wrote back, "I will be there. I will bring the documentation that addresses the accuracy question. I think the council will find it useful." She sent the message. Then she called Ryo. She said, "Good work this morning." He said, "I did not do very much." She said, "You were at your station at 5:45. He said, "You told me to be." She said, "Yes, and you were. That is the work. Being at your station when you are supposed to be at your station. The rest follows from that." He said, "Ambassador, the formation." She said, "Yes." He said, "I saw it on the monitoring feed." She said, "Yes." He said, "The count." She said, "Yes." He said, "And that is not the full picture." She said, "No." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "The chart, position 41. She said, "The chart was accurate within its parameters." He said, "The parameters were insufficient." She said, "Yes." He said, "How long have the parameters been insufficient?" She said, "For approximately as long as Earth has been in the conclave." He said, "And we waited until now to address it." She said, "We waited until the address was the right message at the right moment. Yesterday produced the right moment." He said, "Because of the chart." She said, "Because of what the chart communicated and what the communication required as a response." He said, "The formation was the response." She said, "The transit was the response. The formation was the transit. The transit corridor passes this station." He said, "Coincidentally." She said, "Coincidentally." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Ambassador, I have been on the council floor for 6 months." She said, "Yes." He said, "I am 28 years old." She said, "Yes." He said, "And I have been watching Earth do this for 6 months." She said, "Yes." He said, "How do you know when to do what?" She was quiet for a moment. She thought about 31 years, about 42 years of conclave membership, about 8 months of a production program and 14 months before that, and the accumulated decades of everything that had made the transit corridor at 600 on this particular morning. She said, "You know when the message is right and the moment is available, and what you are is sufficient for what the moment requires." He said, "How do you know if what you are is sufficient?" She said, "You do the work and you find out." He said, "That is very simple." She said, "Yes." He said, "It does not feel simple." She said, "It is not easy. Simple and easy are different." He said, "And if what you are is not sufficient?" She said, "Then you do more work and you find out again." He said, "And if it is still not sufficient?" She said, "Then you find out what more work means and you do it." He said, "Until." She said, "Until what you are is what the moment requires." He said, "And then you send the formation." She said, "And then the transit corridor passes the station on a scheduled exercise." He said, "Coincidentally." She said, "Coincidentally." He was quiet. She said, "Rio, be at your station tomorrow at 8:45. The session starts at 900. He said, "Yes, Ambassador." She ended the call. She looked at the viewport of her office. At Conclave Station Primara in the afternoon, the traffic moving in its ordinary patterns. The transit corridor empty now, the formation long past on its scheduled heading. She thought about the formation. She thought about what it had taken to build it, and what it had taken to know when to show it, and what it had taken to show it in the way that made it a transit rather than a threat, a coincidence rather than a response, a fact rather than a point being made. She thought that the difference between a transit and a threat was everything, and that the difference was in the choices, and that the choices were in the work, and that the work was what they were and what they had always been. She looked at the empty transit corridor. She thought about tomorrow's session. She thought about the chart and position 41 and the parameters that had been insufficient, and the documentation she was going to bring to the session that addressed the accuracy question. She thought the documentation was going to be interesting for the council to read. She thought that was appropriate. She thought the council had been patient for 42 years watching Earth become what Earth was becoming. She thought a little interest was warranted.